In this video, I'll discuss all additional rules as well as some definitions from our glossary in the back of the rulebook that I haven't covered in the previous videos. The first rule is regarding monsters that can be special summoned based on some conditions, such as link monsters, synchro monsters, Exes monsters, pendulum monsters, and certain effect monsters that have special conditions to summon themselves. Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, can be special summoned from your hand by banishing a light monster and a dark monster from your graveyard, and cannot be normal summoned or set, so this would be a special summon monster, and link monsters must be link summoned. The section of the rulebook we'll be looking at is called Special Summon with a Card Effect. Monsters can also be special summoned onto the field through the effect of another card, which is different from a special summon monster, such as Blackluster Soldier and Salamangreat Sunlight Wolf that we were just looking at. You cannot use a card or effect to special summon those monsters from your hand, deck, or graveyard unless it was properly summoned first. For example, if a synchro monster is sent to from your extra deck to the graveyard without being synchro summoned, you cannot use a spell card to special summon it from the graveyard because synchro monsters have to be synchro summoned before you can special summon it by another card's effect. So if you activate a card such as Nadir's Servant, which sends one monster from your extra deck to the graveyard to add a Dogmatica card from your deck to your hand, and you sent Cyframe Lord Omega, you cannot then activate Monster Reborn to target a monster in the graveyard and revive it if that monster was not properly summoned first. So all three of the monsters we've seen so far, Salamangreat Sunlight Wolf, Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning, and Cyframe Lord Omega all require to be properly summoned first. Sunlight Wolf would need to be link summoned, Omega would need to be synchro summoned, and Blackluster Soldier would need to be summoned from the hand using its summoning condition. Now there are some cards in the game whose effects directly contradict the rules of the game, and anytime a card does that, we apply the rules of the card over the rules of the game. One card that comes to mind is called Waking the Dragon. Its effect is, if this set card in its owner's control left the field by an opponent's card effect and is now in the graveyard or is banished, which is its activation condition, you can special summon one monster from your deck or your extra deck. So this allows you to actually special summon certain kinds of monsters. But not all monsters can be summoned this way. If a card has a restriction on it that says it must be summoned in a particular way, then it cannot be summoned by Waking the Dragon. But Salamangreat Sunlight Wolf and Cyframe Lord Omega could be summoned by Waking the Dragon because it summons them from their extra deck. But they wouldn't be able to be summoned from the graveyard if they weren't properly summoned from the extra deck first. If they're summoned by Waking the Dragon, they're not considered properly summoned, but they are being summoned. But if they went to the graveyard, they could not be revived with Monster Reborn. Ultimate Conductor Tyranno is another monster similar to Blackluster Soldier, which says it cannot be normal summoned or set, and it must first be special summoned from your hand by banishing 2 dinosaur monsters from your graveyard. This card has text that specifically says it must first be special summoned this way. So you cannot special summon Ultimate Conductor Tyranno without summoning it properly using its summoning condition. Although there are some cards that override this even. Cards that specifically say they ignore a monster's summoning condition to summon them can be used to summon a monster from a place it's supposed to be. So Double Evolution Pill says you can banish 1 dinosaur and 1 non-dinosaur from your hand and or graveyard to special summon a level 7 or higher dinosaur monster from your hand or deck, ignoring its summoning conditions. Now because Ultimate Conductor is supposed to be kept in your hand or deck, this card is a valid target for Double Evolution Pill because its summoning conditions are being ignored. So generally you cannot special summon a monster that must be special summoned using its own summoning conditions, such as being link summoned, synchro summoned, Exes summoned, pendulum summoned, or special summoned by its own summoning condition from your graveyard or some other unusual place that it's not supposed to be, unless it was summoned properly first. If the card is in the location where it's supposed to be, if you activate a card that ignores its summoning condition, you can still summon it. So that concludes the main part of the rulebook. Now we're going to be looking at other rules. Now I have addressed many parts of the other rules while talking about other topics in the previous videos of this series, so I'll be skipping quite a few of them. I'll be skipping the first 2 things on the Forbidden and Limited List, tokens, and public knowledge, because I've addressed all of those previously. So we're going to start by talking about if both players conduct actions simultaneously. Anytime a card is activated that says that both players must perform the same action simultaneously, one player has to go first, and the player who's going to go first is going to be the turn player. They will choose their targets or select the cards that they need to select, and then the opposing player will do so as well, even if it is possible for both players to do it in a secretive way before revealing the information. For instance, on Infernoid Tiara, if it were fusion summoned using 3 monsters, it has an effect that says both players send 3 cards from their extra deck to the graveyard. Whoever fusion summoned Infernoid Tiara was most likely the turn player. The turn player would choose their 3 monsters to send from their extra deck to the graveyard first, which means the opponent would see what they are, and then they would be able to send 3 cards from their extra deck to the graveyard. A similar type of effect can be found on Dogmatica Maximus, which says, send 2 monsters with different names from your extra deck to the graveyard. Also, your opponent sends 2 monsters from their extra deck to the graveyard. So in this case, if you're activating Maximus, you would send your 2 cards with different names to the graveyard, and then they would send 2 monsters. Even though both parts of both effects are considered to happen simultaneously, the turn player always performs their part of the action first. As I just mentioned earlier in this video, the rulebook specifically says when there are disputes between the rules or a card's effect, the card's effect takes precedence. For example, normally you can only declare an attack with a monster once per turn, but if its effect says you can attack twice, you can attack twice. Generally, every card effect in the game is violating a step of the rules because every card's effect is not something that's done normally if you were only working with normal monsters, so this should make sense. A couple of examples, one of which we mentioned before and one we haven't, would be Void Imagination has the effect to fusion summon by sending itself from the field to the graveyard when it's already face up to perform a fusion summon. Now, because it's a continuous spell card, normally a continuous spell card would need to remain on the field to resolve its effect, but it actually sends itself to the graveyard as a cost, which kind of violates the rules of the game on how continuous spell cards work. So this card wouldn't do anything if it followed the rules of the continuous spell, so this card has to be able to work around that. And the card we mentioned earlier, Waking the Dragon, allows you to special summon monsters from your extra deck, which you normally wouldn't be able to do. So that also violates the rules. So whenever a card's effect violates the rules of the game, you go with the card's effect over the rules of the game. Addressed earlier, there are some actions in the game that you cannot chain to. You can only create a chain by responding to the activation of a card or effect, the summon of a monster, attributing to perform a summon, changing a monster's battle position, paying a cost to summon a monster like Blackluster Soldier are not effects that activate, and therefore you cannot respond to them in chain, which is why in the fast effects timing chart, this is where the turn player takes an action that does not start a chain, and rather than being able to immediately respond with chain rules, we check for trigger effects, and then priority is actually still maintained by the turn player who can activate an effect and start a chain before they pass priority to the opposing player to start a chain. So an action that does not start a chain means that priority stays with the turn player to perform a first action. Now there are some actual cards in the game that also say that you cannot respond to them, but this is different than what's being referred to in the rulebook. A card such as Super Polymerization says, discard 1 card, fusion summon 1 fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters from either field as fusion material. Neither player can activate cards or effects in response to this card's activation. This kind of restriction that says neither player can activate cards or effects in response to this card's activation just means that no card can be activated later in the chain than this card. There are other cards in the game that you can't respond to, and there are cards that sometimes only one player can respond to. Next we'll be talking about Exes Materials. Monsters that are used for an Exes summon are called Exes Material and are placed underneath an Exes monster to show that they are attached to it. Monsters that have become Exes Material are not treated as cards on the field. They are not even considered monsters. Matter of fact, any type of card can be an Exes Material, so a spell card can be Exes Material, usually when placed onto a monster by a card effect. Trap cards can be Exes Material. When an Exes monster would leave the field, all of its Exes Materials are sent to the graveyard, and at that time they are not treated as monsters, which is why in an earlier video I mentioned that under Dimensional Fissure, Exes Materials do go to the graveyard when an Exes monster leaves the field. If an Exes monster is flipped face down or becomes controlled by an opponent, the Exes Material are not sent to the graveyard, they remain attached to the Exes monster. Some cards have the activation condition of when they leave the field. This condition is met as when a monster is sent from the field to the graveyard, banished, returned to the hand, but not when it is returned to the deck or the extra deck or banished face down. Now I am aware that the rulebook here specifically says that that would count if it were returned to the extra deck, but there is actually a rule update that occurred since the last time they've updated the rulebook, so I'll just briefly put that on screen. That is the 2021 Master Rule Updates. This happened on April 1st, 2021. Part 5 says on page 51 of the rulebook, where it says under leaves the field, when a monster leaves the field is shuffled in the main deck or becomes Exes Material is no longer considered to be on the field. However, its effect that activates when it leaves the field will not activate. So a monster does not leave the field. So for a monster to leave the field, it needs to be on the field, and it needs to be either sent to the graveyard, banished, or returned to the hand. But a monster does not leave the field if it is returned to the main deck, or the extra deck, or it is banished face down. If the monster is banished face down, or in the deck face down, or in the extra deck face down, it's not somewhere where it can activate to reveal what it is to activate. So in any place where it would be face down, it can't trigger. And that's it for other rules. Now we'll just briefly look over the glossary of terms that show up on other cards. First is to attack directly. Attacking directly means that a monster attacks a player's life points instead of the monster's. In this case, damage is dealt to the player, equal to the attack of the attacking monster. Some monsters have effects that allow them to attack directly, even if an opponent controls a monster. such as Zodiac Borbo, which we mentioned in a previous video. Banished cards, or on older cards that might say removed from play cards, are cards that are placed into its own separate zone, which I've mentioned earlier in previous videos is called the Banished Zone, which doesn't really exist on the field. Even though the cards are removed from play, you do have to put them back in your deck for the next game. A monster is considered to have battled if it has declared an attack or been attacked and both monsters made it through the damage step up to damage calculation. So if a monster leaves the field before damage calculation, the monsters are not considered to have battled, although they will be considered to have attacked. A very common play that occurs in a lot of decks is a player will attempt to declare an attack with their Exes monster, which allows them to perform the special summoning condition of Divine Arsenal AA Zeus Sky Thunder, whose requirement is to be Exe summoned over an Exe monster that has battled this turn. So if an Exe monster tries to battle, players will attempt to prevent the battle from occurring by removing the monster during the damage step before damage calculation so that the monster has never battled. So if an Exes monster hasn't battled, Divine Arsenal AA Zeus cannot be summoned, using its alternate summoning condition. Battle damage is the damage inflicted to a player by a monster attacking, either their life points directly or when battle occurs between two monsters and there's a difference in their attack values. Damage inflicted by card effects is called effect damage. Cards on the field consider cards in the monster zones and the spell and trap card zones, but not cards in your deck, extra deck, or graveyard or banish zone, because those cards are not technically part of the field. The field are the active cards in the game. So your field spell, your spell and trap card zones, your main monster zones, and your extra monster zone. A colon and a semicolon are on cards, and they are used to tell us a little bit about the effect of a card using problem-solving card text. Text before a colon is the information on the condition to activate a card. Text before a semicolon is what you do when the card is activated, often referred to as the cost, but technically the activation condition can also occur before the semicolon. Any text that comes after the semicolon is what happens when the effect resolves. So here's a couple of examples. If you were to normal summon or special summon Fallen of Albaz, which is its activation condition, which can't be used during the damage step, it doesn't fit the requirements of the cards that activate in the damage step, which we covered in a previous video. So its condition is when it's summoned. Its cost is to discard a card, which you can see is before a semicolon. Its effect is to fusion summon a fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters on either player's field, including this card, but you cannot use other monsters you control as fusion material. So when you normal summon Albaz, you can trigger its effect, starting its chain as Chainlink 1. And because it has a cost, the cost is paid when the card is activated. So immediately once you say Chainlink 1, I'll activate Fallen of Albaz, you discard the card. And then when the chain resolves and you're resolving Chainlink 1, you perform the fusion summon. No Punk Foxy Tune has an effect as well. You can send this card from your hand or your field to the graveyard as the cost to activate this effect. So when you activate this during your main phase, because it's not a quick effect, it sends itself to the graveyard as a cost. It then, as part of its effect, sends another card from your hand to the graveyard. This one is not a cost. So when you activate No Punk Foxy Tune, it immediately sends itself to the graveyard when you activate it because it's a cost. Then when its effect resolves, when the chain resolves backwards, it sends a card from your hand to the graveyard, and if it successfully makes it to the graveyard, it'll special summon a punk monster from the deck that isn't level 8. So a discard can occur as part of a card's effect, or it can occur as a part of a card's cost. But if it occurs as part of the card's cost, it occurs when the chain link is started, rather than when the card resolves. Cards you control are cards that are on the field, but your field. So cards in your main monster zones, or your extra monster zone, or your field spell zone, or your spell and trap card zones, or your pendulum zones are cards that you control. Cards in your possession can include all cards that belong to you. That includes your deck, your extra deck, your graveyard, your banished cards, cards that are in the process of being summoned to your side of the field, the Exes Materials attached to the cards that you control. If a player takes control of a card from their opponent and moves it to the other player's field, they now possess the card, but if the card would be returned to the hand or sent to the graveyard, it will return to the owner. So the only way you can control someone else's card is for a card effect to let you control it or to have it in your hand, but whenever the card would be used, it would eventually return back to the opponent. A card is destroyed if it's sent to the graveyard by a battle or if it's destroyed by a card effect. A card that is sent to the graveyard, returned to the hand, or anything other than specifically being said to be destroyed is not considered being destroyed. To discard a card is to send a card from your hand to the graveyard, although other cards might say just send a card from your hand to the graveyard, which is not considered a discard. So a discard is a very specific type of method in which a card is sent from the hand to the graveyard. Discard is often referenced as a cost on cards or part of the effects of cards. It's also what you do during your end phase if you have more than 6 cards in your hand. Any card that becomes equipped to a monster is called an equipment card. In different scenarios, you might have a monster equipped with a spell. It may or may not be an equipment spell. trap cards, or monster cards. In the rulebook here it says equip traps remain trap cards, and equip monsters are considered to be equipment spell cards, while they're in the spell and trap card zone. If a monster is equipped to another monster, if a card is equipped to any monster, it normally can't be moved from one card to another, although Union monsters are a special type of monster I mentioned much earlier, and they have ways to move from one card to another. Obviously, any card effect that says it would move an equipment spell to another card can move it, but Union monsters can kind of move themselves. Here's an example. Beatbuster Drake is a Union monster. It says once per turn you can either target a light machine monster you control and equip this card to that target, or unequip this card and special summon it. So if Beatbuster Drake is not equipped to a monster, it can equip itself to a monster, and if it was equipped to a monster, it can unequip itself to a monster. So Union monsters can kind of get onto other monsters by using their effect to equip and unequip themselves over time. And now the last page of the rulebook. An equipped monster is a monster that currently has an equipment card on it, and is often referenced on certain cards' effects. It'll say to do something to an equipped monster. If a monster is destroyed or flip face down, the equipped cards it has lose their targets and are destroyed and sent to the graveyard. To excavate is to take cards from the top of your deck and reveal them to both players. Then before you do anything else, you apply the instructions on the card, and the cards that are excavated are then placed wherever the card that says that they go. Cards that are being excavated are considered to be in the deck until they are sent somewhere by the instructions on the card. For example, Reasoning is a spell card where your opponent declares a level from 1 to 12. You excavate cards from the top of your deck until you excavate a monster that can be normal summoned or set. So you'll just keep kind of dealing cards from the top of the deck into a pile until you reach a monster that can be normal summoned or set. Then, if that monster has the same level as the one declared by your opponent, you send all of the excavated cards to the graveyard. So the cards are all considered to go from your deck straight to the graveyard. If they call the level wrong, which more likely than not they will because there are 12 levels to choose from, and their odds of hitting the correct level from 1 to 12 is not that likely, you special summon the excavated monster, and then all the remaining cards are sent to the graveyard. So this is a kind of card that requires you to excavate, and it tells you where the cards are placed, but they're all considered to go from the deck to those places. So if the monster is summoned, it comes from the deck to the field. If the cards all go to the graveyard, they're considered to go from the deck to the graveyard. Some cards refer to a monster's original attack or defense. The original attack and defense of a monster is the attack or defense value printed on that card. So if the card's attack has been modified by an equipment spell, and a card refers to its original attack, you're not using its current attack, you're using its original attack. The word current attack may appear on cards as well. The monster Nibiru the Primal Being has the following effect. During the main phase, if your opponent normal or special summons 5 or more monsters during this turn, it has a quick effect. You contribute as many monsters on the field as possible, and if you do, special summon this card from your hand, and then special summon one Primal Being token to your opponent's field. It says this token's attack and defense become the combined original attack and defense of the tributed monsters. So you have to see what the original attack and defense are of the monsters when you summon the token for the Primal Being token. Now, important to note that the Primal Being token's attack and defense are actually question mark. So if a card were used on the Primal Being token based on its original attack and defense, the original attack and defense of the Primal Being token are actually 0-0. So if a card's original attack and defense are question mark, it is considered to be 0. If it said that the original attack of the token would become the combined original attack and defense of the monsters tributed, then the Primal Being token would have original attack and defense equal to the attack of the total monsters tributed and the defense of the total monsters tributed, but it doesn't. Its original attack and defense are question mark, which are considered 0 in most cases. Not all cases. There's a card called Small World, in which its attack and defense are considered question mark. A cost is an action that your player is required to perform in order to activate a card or summon a monster. So anything before a semicolon would be required to activate a card. Banishing a light and dark monster, as we mentioned earlier on Blackluster Soldier, would be the cost to summon the monster. Performing a tribute to summon a tribute summon monster are all considered versions of costs. Other common costs are discarding cards, paying life points, or banishing cards. You have to pay any costs before you declare that you're activating a card. Usually when you have a card that activates and it starts a chain link, when the card is activated, you pay the cost. But technically the cost is paid before the next card can be activated. If the activation of the card is negated or the summon of the monster is negated, you do not get a refund for the cost that you have paid. Some monsters can do what is called piercing damage or piercing battle damage. Piercing damage is damage inflicted to a monster when a monster in attack position declares an attack against a monster in defense position, and the attack of the attack monster is higher than the defense of the defense monster. Normally, when you attack a defense position monster, no damage is inflicted to the owner of the defense position monster should it be destroyed by the battle. But piercing damage just means that the damage is inflicted to the owner of the monster in defense position. When a card effect says to choose something randomly, there's no actual official method for doing so. So any method that both players are comfortable doing is fine as long as it's properly random, in the sense that all options available are equally as selectable. So here's an example, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Revealing a card means to show a card to your opponent. Usually it's a card that is face down or concealed in your hand. To show it to your opponent is to reveal the card. Usually after you reveal a card, it is returned to being face down or hidden again in your hand. An example that we are going to discuss is also important for selecting things at random would be Danger Bigfoot. Its effect says you can reveal this card in your hand, so the activation condition for this card is to show it to your opponent. You then put it back in your hand face down. Your opponent then randomly chooses one card from your entire hand. So the way that they would select the card in your hand is you would probably spread out your hand after shuffling it so your opponent doesn't know where the Danger Bigfoot is, and then they just select one of the cards, as long as they can't tell which one is which. You can also assign each card a number on a die and have them roll the die for that number. Usually any number that didn't have a card assigned to it would be considered a re-roll, so you just roll again. That way that the probability of selecting any card randomly is equivalent. Whenever you search a deck, if a card effect asks you to search your deck or to add a card from your deck to your hand or to special summon a monster from your deck, you pick up your deck, you go through it, you find an appropriate target, you either summon it or add it to your hand after making sure your opponent gets to see it and verify that it fits the criteria of the card that was activated originally. You then shuffle your deck and allow your opponent to cut your deck, and then you place your deck back in your deck zone. In order to activate a card that would search your deck or summon a monster from your deck, a target should exist in your deck. So you should be familiar with your deck list to make sure that that is something you can do when you activate the card, with the exception of a mandatory effect, which must be activated even if there is no valid target. A card is considered to be sent to the graveyard if it makes its way into your graveyard from any location: your hand, your deck, your extra deck, your field spell zone, if it's destroyed, if it's tributed, if it's used for the material for a monster. There is one exception, that if you have a card that is banished and it is returned to the graveyard, it is not considered to be sent to the graveyard. So if you were to activate the card Burial from a Different Dimension, which says you can target 3 monsters that are banished, and return them to the graveyard, and you targeted Destiny Hero Celestial, Destiny Hero Celestial would be returned to the graveyard, which is important because there are some cards that have this clause on them. The effect of Destiny Hero Celestial says while you have no cards in your hand except the turn this card is sent to the graveyard, which is its activation condition, you can banish this card and 1 Destiny Hero monster from your graveyard and draw 2 cards. Because Destiny Hero Celestial was returned to the graveyard from Burial of a Different Dimension, it was not sent to the graveyard this turn. So a card that would normally activate when it's sent to the graveyard will not activate if it's returned from the Banished Zone, and if it had an effect that could not be used the turn it was sent to the graveyard, if it was returned to the graveyard from the Banished Zone, you can use it that turn. So this is just a strange exception, but most other things that would send a card, if the card winds up in the graveyard in just about every other way, it's considered to be sent to the graveyard. Whenever shuffling your deck, there is technically no restriction on how you shuffle your deck. It just should be fast. It should not take too long to do, and it should not damage your cards, and the cards should not be visible while shuffling them. They should be face down in some manner. To tribute a card means to send a monster you control to your graveyard. You can tribute a face-up or face-down monster unless a card says otherwise. Ritual spells tribute monsters from your hand or your field, so that's something that's different. Tributing a monster is one possible cost for summoning a monster that's level 5 or higher. And generally you can only tribute your own monsters unless a card says otherwise. And that's going to wrap up the rest of the rulebook. I hope you learned how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. If I missed anything go throughout the entire series, feel free to leave comments and let me know what you want to hear about in the future. That way I can make sure that if I have to cover additional things, I do.